Genesis is the first book of the Bible and absolutely necessary for our understanding of the rest of the scriptures. Our guest today is Dr. Jacques Doukhan, professor of Hebrew and Old Testament exegesis. So I invite you to take your Bible, a notebook, and join the conversation. Dr. Doukhan, thank you very much for being with us.
Yeah, the pleasure is mine.
We're going to talk today about the Pentateuch, and especially about the first book of the Bible,
Genesis.
The book of Genesis, yes. Why is this book important for us today?
Well, it has been said that the book of Genesis is the most important book in the Bible.
Wow.
Not only because it is the first book, but also being the first book, it is the book which is the most referred to in the whole scriptures. And if you don't have the book of Genesis, you would not be able to understand anything in the Bible. They all refer to this book, back to this book. It's a book which actually encompasses the whole theology of the Bible. So really, this is really the basis. And this is why it is important. It's also an important book, because this is the book, more than any other book, which is shared with other religions.
Oh, okay.
You know, we talk about Judaism, Islam, Christianity, and beyond, which really share a number of fundamental themes and motives and truths with the book of Genesis, more than any other book in the Bible. So
it is true.
Really this book.
It is true, because the book of the Bible, we don't have religions. We have Adam and
Right.
humanity
so
and God,
this is
and that's
really
it.
the book which is the most known by all the religions.
Okay.
And this is the book, of course, also which you know, give us information about our common roots, our common sources. So this is the book. This is the book which speaks about where we come from. So in that sense, it is. And I will come back to this, because this is also which, being a book speaking about our origins, is also going to be the book which will speak about our destination.
Another important question is, who wrote the book of Genesis?
Well, recently, I mean, since the 19th century, the book of Genesis was considered having been written by several people coming from different sources. That's the so-called documentary hypothesis. This is, of course, an idea which was not the original idea from the time of the Bible, Old Testament, New Testament. Until 19th century, people believed that it was written by the book of Moses. But today, by looking more carefully at the evidence, at really the scriptural evidence, we have a number of evidences coming from the text which suggest indeed that the traditional view that Moses was the author of the book of Genesis was correct. We have a couple, just to give you a couple of indication. The fact, for instance, that the person who has the language of the book of Genesis is very coherent. There is there are not different.
It's the same pen.
It's the same pen, the same grammar, the same syntax, the same words. You know, throughout the book of Genesis, and you read the first part of Genesis, and the whole is the same. The first evidence. The second evidence is the antiquity. The fact that this book has been written, you know, by someone who knew a lot about the Egyptians. The third evidence would be the fact that the last phrase, one of the last phrases of the book of Genesis, recurs in the book of Exodus when Moses is the hero. The same words are used, and that suggests that really this is Moses who was the author of the book of Genesis.
Now, can you tell us a little bit about the structure of the book of Genesis and the message of the book of Genesis?
I think the structure is telling us the same thing. there have been a lot of studies on the structure. Some people said, well, this book is divided in 2 sections, chapter 1 to 11, and then the other sections. These are a bit, there is some truth in that, but at the same time, there is a problem with that division, because this is a division which is suspicious, because it's a division which suggests that we have one section which is kind of mythological. You know, we call it a primal. You know, we talk about the creation, the flood, Babel. You know, all these events which are you know, events about humanity in general, universal event. At the same time, they are not a part directly to our history. So we say these are mythological events, you know, primary events, 1 to 11, and then the rest is just historical. But that's not the right, I think it's not the structure which is suggested by the book itself.
Okay.
The book itself is structured around a word which is repeated in a very regular manner, and that is Toledot, genealogies. And you have, first creation story is a genealogy. And then you have 10 genealogies, 10, you have 5 genealogies in the first section, then 5 genealogies in the second section. And in the middle, you have Genesis 12, and Genesis, which goes until Genesis 22. This is the central. And the central part, the central section, you have no genealogy. So you have 5 before, 5 after, and you have the central section, which is framed with these 2 words which occurred in 2 places. Lech lecha, go. Yeah. And you have the story about, you know, the whole story about Abraham. Now, having said that, so that's a part of the structure. Now, there is a second information about the structure which follows that, you know, cutting which I indicated, and that is this back and forth movement between let's say Garden of Eden and Babel, between Promised Land and Egypt. If you just follow that geographical setting, you will see that there is a back and forth. You begin in Eden, where you have Adam. That's the beginning. And then after this you have Eden to Babel. Okay? Then you have after Babel, you have from Babel to the Promised Land. Okay. And then you have from the Promised Land to Egypt. Yes. And then at the very end, you have beyond, you know, they are in Egypt, the prospect of the Promised Land, but in connection to Eden. Yes. So you go back to the beginning. So you have a back and forth like this between Babel, between Eden and Babel, and then between
the Promised Land.
Babel and to the Promised Land, and to the Promised Land to Egypt. So back and forth, Babel, Promised Land, Egypt. So you have this, you know, back and forth movement between the exile and the place where you are supposed to be, where you want to be, where you have been. And that's the book of Genesis.
It's very interesting. So you have mentioned that the structure then has, we can approach it through, from the perspective of the Toledot, these generations, or these genealogies, yes. And therefore we have 5 genealogies before, 5 in the end, and in the center, the story of Abraham.
No genealogy, because Abraham has no genealogy. Oh, interestingly. In this whole section, you have Abraham by himself, Lech Lecha. When he is asked to leave his roots, his parents, his country, right? And then at the end, when he's asked to leave, to sacrifice his son, his future. So here is Abraham, who is suspended in the void, right? He has to leave his roots, and then at the end he has to leave his future. He has no past, no future, completely suspended, hanging in the void. That's the figure of faith.
So you would say that Abraham, then being in the center and being this special location, the story about him is part of the central message of Genesis as well. Right. Yes. Now,
the covenant with Abraham.
Yes, which will be basic for the next.
Which is the whole, the future.
For the future.
For the other books.
Yes, for all the other books,
Right,
correct.
right.
Now, another question that I have is that you have mentioned that people have made a difference between the first 11 chapters and the rest, 12 to 50.
Right.
And so they think that these are mythologies. Right. These are myths about it. And some people think that they are not really, it's not really important if they are literal or not.
Right.
Is it important that we understand the first 11 chapters of Genesis as literal?
Right. Yeah, from the point of view of the testimony of the scriptures, from the point of view of the text which is given to us, it is very important. The reader writes this and to suggest to us that it is important. So one evidence to that is the fact that while this interpretation of mythological interpretation is making a distinction between the mythological and the historical, the author of Genesis makes a connection between these two sections, precisely through the genealogies. Creation is the genealogy. It's a Toldot. And then you have also Noah, who is also a genealogy. So you have genealogy. So you have genealogies from the very beginning, and the whole book articulates itself around the genealogies. So that indicates clearly that when you have a genealogy, what does it mean? Well, in a Semitic culture, you are because I know your father. I say, who are you? Then you say, my father is. If you have no father and mother, you don't exist. You are no history. So the genealogy is a way of establishing history. It's a way of indicating that you are historical, you are real, you exist. Right? So the fact that you have a genealogy with Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and so forth, and then before with creation, it connects all these events of patriarchal history to the so-called primary history. It's the same kind of history, the same quality of history. They are all, related to that particular, Toldot genealogy.
Very good. History. So it means then that if the other genealogies are literal, actual events, the first one have to be as well literal,
and there is
actual
also something else. When you talk about mythological, what does it mean, a myth? Well, a myth, it's an event which could have taken place or not have taken place. That's not very important, right? That's the way it is seen. So it's not very important. What is happening is in Greek and classic literature, I think this whole issue we are talking about generates from studies in classical literature. What is happening in classical literature, in Greek literature and so forth, is that the philosopher, say Plato, he has an idea, he has a philosophy, and he wants to illustrate that idea. So then what does he do? He goes and draws from the stories he heard, which are historical or not, can be fables, doesn't matter, and he draws from there inspiration to illustrate his philosophy, his idea. So what is important is his idea. It starts with his idea.
Not the story.
And not the story. The story is not important. The story is here to illustrate his idea. So it's not very important. What is important is his idea. It's not the way the Hebrew scriptures have been shaped. It's not the way they are thinking. Actually, you begin with the history, with the historical event. And because you have a historical event, it is meaningful. The meaning comes out of history, and it's not something which precedes history. It took place. Therefore, it is meaningful. Right? So that's really the big, I think, the big misunderstanding, big confusion we have.
I think that's a very important idea.
So if you don't have history, there is no meaning. This is why it is important. History is important.
Now, Dr. Doukhan, there are other creation myths that have been preserved until our days. What is the relationship between Genesis and these other creation myths? Are there resemblances? Are there similarities or differences? What can you say about that?
Well, we can say that we have to recognize that there are some parallels, but what does it mean? What is the function of these parallels? Why do we have these parallels? First of all, we need to understand that there are also differences. The most important difference is that the intention of these stories we have outside of the Bible. When you study this so-called accounts of origins in ancient Egypt and in Babylonian, you realize that the setting of these stories has nothing to do with the intention of reporting an event, but has more to do with the actual contemporary condition, like politics or like a concern of ethics. And so when they speak about origins, it's a reference to origin which they use and apply to their particular situation. Whereas in the context of the Bible, you begin with that particular event, right? You are not referring to it because you are in a particular situation. You refer to it because it happened. You start then with the intention of reporting a historical event, all right? And this is why it is called a genealogy, a toledot, right? This is really the first intention, to report the event. And so when we have some parallels, the parallels, let's say allusions or evocations to the other traditions, we have this parallel, so-called parallel or allusions to them, they are intentional to say that the creation of the Bible has nothing to do with them. While the others are involving the gods, right? In Genesis 1, you have no gods involved except that the God who created. Okay. Whereas one example, for instance, is while in the other accounts you have the gods of the sun god or the moon god who is involved, who has been created but still involved in the production of creation. In this story of Genesis 1, this so-called God, Shemesh and Yareach, those have no name. Instead of talking about the sun and the moon, they talk about the bigger light and the small light. So they are just instruments, right? The same with the fish. In the ancient Near Eastern culture, water was a god, and the fish out of water was the god who actually created
the fish.
The fish, the big fish, the dragon. He created, he's the creator. Now, suddenly we have the same word, big fish, which is used, but in connection with creation. It's interesting that the word bara is used only when you create men, when you create heaven and earth in the beginning, when you create humans, and when you create fish. Why the fish? Because the fish, in their imagination, is the creator, is God. No, it says no, it's created. It's a small fry. That's all it is.
So the Genesis, the Genesis is a polemic against.
It's a polemic against. So this defines itself as something which the others are not. We are not like that. But at the same time, they are producing something completely unique, which is not found elsewhere, right? And that is the regular, beautiful, symmetric creation of heaven and earth. They are telling us that God created heaven and earth, and they are telling us also about, the story about this creation, right? So it is very important that we realize what they are saying here. We are not just talking about the message of God who created. We are talking about also the message that God created. The message of this event of creation.
Very interesting. Now, some people think that the book of Genesis is the result of a long process, which there were probably 4 documents that were finally included into one document by an editor or a process. how do we relate to this documentary hypothesis? Can you explain a little bit that, and how do we relate to that?
Right. This is precisely what we call this. These theories of several layers or several sources, which actually made up, one after the other, produce, the Pentateuch, or in the Book of Genesis. This is what we call, documentary hypothesis. It's a hypothesis, which is, by the way, no longer recognized a knowledge today by even critical scholars. Although they sometimes, flirt with it. I mean, they always refer to it.
They cannot leave it still.
They cannot, but still today, for people who are really at the edge of biblical scholarship, they are recognized for all kinds of evidence, biblical, archaeological, literary, linguistic. Today they have recognized that this whole theory, which was produced in the 18th century for the first time, by a medical doctor who was reading the scriptures and read Genesis 1 and 2 and realized that we had two names of God, and we had two different perspectives. The first one in Genesis 1, you had the great God Elohim, in the creation of the whole universe, and humans became just a little dust. They have a little dot. And in the second creation story, suddenly we have a new name of God. It's no longer just Elohim. We have Yahweh, Elohim Yahweh. So it is systematic, right? In the first one, you have just Elohim. In the second one, you have Elohim Yahweh. So different name and different perspective. While in the first creation story, you have great God, transcendent God, and the God of the universe. In the second creation story, you have a focus.
So he thought that these were two different
sources, two different, and then later on, two different traditions, two different schools. This is the way you had that, this documentary hypothesis. So two different authors, certainly. But now we have understood, by the way, that these are parallels. These two texts are parallels. Actually, it was written by the same person who was actually talking about two different perspectives which complement each other. And we have learned to discover that in biblical literature and then also outside of the Bible, ancient literature, this way of speaking, the general and the particular, the universal and really the more focused. So, and they complement each other, and people have recognized that. So this is why, the documentary hypothesis had, they realized that was not really satisfactory. Another reason why it was not also satisfactory is the fact that when they indicated we have two different sources, let's just speak from the beginning of the history of that documentary, two different sources, and two different, when you have this particular source, we have this name Elohim. When we have this other particulars, we have this name Yahweh. And these are two different sources, these two different mentalities. One is more primitive, and the other one is more advanced. You see, and then it tells you that we come from the most primitive to the more advanced. Again, indicating, the way they were thinking, these interpreters, saying that we come from the most primitive and it evolves to the more advanced. And this has affected that documentary hypothesis. Now we have realized that, for instance, you have the name Elohim in this text, you have the name Yahweh in that, and they are the same. So they're not different. Right? And sometimes you have Elohim, text with Elohim, another text with the same name Elohim, and they are different. So that's one of the examples, but there are many other evidences which actually had, told us that, this whole idea of the documentary hypothesis doesn't work. It's not right.
Now, we have 2 minutes and a half, and would you summarize for us what is the message, the central message of Genesis, and probably how it relates to the Pentateuch as a whole?
All right. When you try to understand the so-called theology, the message of the book of Genesis, in order to capture, the most important idea, you need to look at what are the words which are repeated all the time. What are the key words which are? Let's say that the first important key word, which I have already indicated, is the word toledot, which is history. So the first idea is that we are talking about history. But not just history, is that God is behind that history. God is controlling that history. God has created, the creator, the one who created, is also present in our history. And when we say he is present in history, that means that he has not only the first word, he has also the last word. And sometimes he turns the events into his will. Okay? The story of Joseph, you know, where you see Joseph, who has been, sent to Egypt, and
as
has
a slave,
been enslaved and so forth. And then at the end, he's suggesting actually the whole theology of history and of his own life, and also the whole theology of the book of Genesis, that God has turned this into good. Right? And this is a very important message also for us. While we go sometimes through all kinds of, pains in our life and problems, if you just trust God, just, let him work for you.
Yes.
You will see that even the bad you are doing is going to be turned into good.
It's very interesting because the fall in Genesis, if we let him work, he can turn this into good.
He's the God of creation. He's the God who turned the nothingness, the darkness into light. Right? He's the God who will turn, your pain and your suffering into praise and into light. So that's the first. Second thing is the theology of birth, which is really, Toldot comes from the word yalad, which means birth. Yes. So genealogy is, it's a genealogy, it's a history, but it has also this idea of birth. And births in the book of Genesis are very important. They are very important precisely because God is working there.
Yes.
And they are not natural births. You have a barren person, a barren woman who gives birth. You have a very old woman who gives birth. Yes. And this birth is very important because this is through these births that the messianic seed will find its way through the Messiah. Jesus Christ, David, Jesus Christ will come, from. So these are very important births. They are births which are providing, the channel for salvation, right? Which has been salvation, the seed, in Genesis 3:15. This whole event of Genesis 3:15, so where you have here also after the story of the woman and Adam and Eve who had the fall of Adam and Eve. God turns this fall into salvation, Genesis 3:15. So that's the birth, and then at the end, the last, that will be the third message, the third facet of the message of the book of Genesis is that the book of Genesis is the book of at the end. It's a book also which provides you with the last word of God, which is the word of salvation. It's interesting that when you reach the end of the book of Genesis and you suddenly hear the last verses which carry the hope of the promised land, at the same time the last word, when you hear the last word Bemitzrayim in Egypt, you hear also the first word Bereshit. You have in the shape of the word Bemitzrayim, you can
in
hear,
Egypt, which means in Egypt, right?
Bereshit. So in the words, you are a kind of a play on word, which is made. There are many other evidences to what I'm saying here, but this would be one of them. Is that when you hear the last word, you hear at the same time the first word. You are back to the beginning. In other words, through the hope of the promised land, you have the hope of the Garden of Eden. So you reach the end of the book of Genesis, and at the end of the book of Genesis, you have the hope of returning to what we have lost, and that is the Garden of Eden, the place where Adam was. That's the last message of the book of Genesis, message of hope.